Council is called to order.
Предварительная повестка дня данного заседания гласит: письмо постоянного представителя Украины при Организации Объединенных Наций от 28 февраля 2014 года на имя председателя Совета Безопасности С-2014-136. Повестка дня утверждается. На основании правила 37 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителей Германии и Украины. Решение принимается. На основании правила я также приветствую на сегодняшнем заседании генерального секретаря Организации Объединенных Наций Антонио Гутерреша. Заседание также примет участие на основании 39-й временных правил процедуры Совета заместитель генерального секретаря по политическим вопросам и вопросам миростроительства госпожа Розмари Де Карло. Сейчас Совет Безопасности приступит к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. Я хотел бы приветствовать его превосходительство генерального секретаря Антонио Гутерреша и предоставить ему слово.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, I want to reaffirm what I expressed this morning in the meeting of the General Assembly. But of course, it wouldn't make any sense to bother you reading again the same text that I'm sure you are all aware of. In between, during the day, a number of events took place, and with your permission, Mr. President, I would like to ask Ms. Rosemary Di Carlo to be able to brief you on those events. But simultaneously, the day was full of rumors and indications that an offensive against the Ukraine was imminent. In the recent past, there were several situations with similar indications, similar rumors. And I never believed in them, convinced that nothing serious would happen. I was wrong. And I would like not to be wrong again today. So, if indeed an operation is being prepared, I have only one thing to say from the bottom of my heart. President Putin, stop your troops from attacking the Ukraine. Give peace a chance. Too many people have already died. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Secretary General for his introductory remarks. And I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary Di Carlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier today, the so-called authorities of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics requested military assistance from the Russian Federation. Also today, the Ukrainian authorities declared a nationwide state of emergency and announced other related defense and security measures, including the mobilization of reservists. Throughout the day, we've seen disturbing reports of continued heavy shelling across the contact line and civilian and military casualties. There are also reports of the repeated targeting of civilian infrastructure. This evening, different media are carrying reports of an ongoing large-scale military buildup and on military columns moving towards Ukraine. The Russian Federation has also reportedly shut airspace to civilian aircraft near the border with Ukraine. The United Nations cannot verify any of these reports, but if these developments were confirmed, they would greatly aggravate an already dangerous situation. The Ukrainian authorities are also reporting a new large-scale cyber attack targeting several state and financial institutions. Mr. President, President Zelensky earlier this evening called for continued diplomacy. Separately, President Putin also spoke about his continued readiness to engage in dialogue. We encourage such efforts, even at this late hour. UN staff remain on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. We are committed to staying and delivering. All parties must ensure their safety and security. Respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law is also paramount. We cannot predict exactly what will happen in the coming hours and days in Ukraine. What is clear is the unacceptably high cost in human suffering and destruction of an escalation. The people of Ukraine want peace, and I'm certain the people of Russia want peace. We must do everything in our power to ensure that peace prevails. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor first to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, this is the fourth time the Council is meeting in Ukraine in a matter of weeks. Every time we meet, reality on the ground confirms bit by bit what some of us have been anticipating. Russia has been saying one thing and doing its contrary. We were told troops were retreating when they only have increased. We were told to stop hysteria since troops were in Russian territory. No longer. They are invading a neighbor, unprovoked, with false pretexts, false narratives, and fabricated news. Every development unfolding in the last 48 hours confirms, to us and to the world, that Russian worries have nothing to do with its security, that its anxieties are not linked to NATO enlargement, that this issue is not a confrontation between Russia and the West. This is a confrontation between Russia and international law, the UN Charter that it deliberately has chosen to ignore, a confrontation between a hegemonistic vision and the rules-based world order. Dear colleagues, it's not about Russia's concern, it's about Russia's appetite. The Ukrainians are facing another aggression just because they dare to exist, because they have chosen to be independent, because they have opted for democracy. Dear colleagues, this is a dark hour not only for Ukraine, but for the entire international community as we witness with trepidation the progression of a pure act of aggression carefully planned and cold-bloodedly being executed. We called and hoped for a back down of the Russian Federation from this senseless, destructive and self-destructive action. We repeat the same call for Russia to stop, to reflect, to reverse its illegal decisions, to withdraw from this senseless madness, to de-escalate, not to push towards precipice. Several mechanisms are in place and various proposals have been made, including by President Zelensky, whose calls remain unanswered. Diplomacy is like hope. It dies last. But for it to work, it must be seized, not ignored, as the Secretary General just called for here. We call on the fellow members of the Security Council to rally in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia has been warned repeatedly that they will be alone in this foolishness, that they will be responsible for the innocent lives lost, including Russians maybe, and for the destruction caused in the heart of Europe in the 21st century. If they choose to continue to execute their plans, as everything indicates, they will bear not only the consequences of the war, but also the historical blame and shame of invading a neighboring country when its responsibility as a big country, as a permanent member of the Security Council, calls for it to work and help preserve peace and security, not to torpedo it. We reiterate our support to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally organized borders and territorial waters. In concluding, I welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to this meeting. I would like to convey to him, to the Ukrainian government and people, that at this most critical moment in their history, they are not alone, and we stand firm in full solidarity with them for their rights to be free and choose who they want to be. I thank you.
Я благодарю
I
представителя
thank the
Албании за его
representative of
заявление и
Albania
сейчас
for his
предоставляю
statement and now
слово
give the
представителю
floor
Соединенных Штатов.
to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Secretary General. Thank you for your strong stance and your powerful remarks today at the General Assembly and for your remarks tonight. Colleagues, a few moments ago, I spoke to President Biden, who asked me to convey in the strongest possible terms his and our steadfast support for Ukraine and support for the urgent meeting this Council has convened tonight. Furthermore, he asked me to share that the United States and our allies and partners will continue to respond to Russia's actions with unity, with clarity, and with conviction. We are here tonight because we believe, along with Ukraine, that a full-scale further invasion into Ukraine by Russia is imminent. Tonight, we're seeing the Russians close airspace, move troops into Donbass, and move forces into combat-ready positions. This is a perilous moment, and we're here for one reason and one reason only: to ask Russia to stop, return to your borders, send your troops and your tanks and your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and send your diplomats to the negotiating table. Back away from the brink before it is too late. Last week, the United States informed this Council and the world about what we expected to see unfold. We said that Russia would manufacture a pretext for an attack. We have since seen numerous false flag events staged along the lines of contact in Donbass. We said Russia would theatrically convene emergency meetings at the highest levels of the Russian government. We all saw this on Monday with the state televised Security Council meeting held by President Putin, an orchestrated moment in which the Russian government decided to recognize as, and I quote, independent states, unquote, sovereign territory of Ukraine controlled by Russia's proxies since 2014. They literally violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity on live television before the world. We said that false proclamations would come declaring Russia would need to defend Russian speakers in Ukraine. We got that and much more from President Putin's speech on Monday and during the speech of the Russian ambassador in the General Assembly today. No one could have predicted just how dangerous, inciting, and far-reaching President Putin's speech would be, with Putin arguing for taking the world back in time to an era of empires and colonies. Finally, we said the attack would come next, that we could expect communications to be jammed, cyber attacks to shut down key Ukrainian institutions. Last week, we attributed to Russia denial of service attacks against Ukrainian banks, and we saw similar activity this morning targeting government sites as well. And in the last few hours, we have received very concerning reports of destructive malware placed on hundreds of computers and executed on at least some. After that, we said would come the bombs and missiles, the soldiers and the tanks. Already soldiers have been deployed to the occupied region of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight because we believe the rest is imminent. Now, over the past few weeks, Russia has called our predictions hysterical. Russia said we were lying. Russia said we were supplying the world with misinformation. Russia's diplomats even laughed in the face of the human suffering we were sounding the alarm about. But what we said would happen has come to pass for all the world to see. So let us be clear. All parties are not culpable here. There's no middle ground. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. Russia's attack on Ukraine is tantamount to an attack on the UN and every member state in the chamber tonight. The Security Council is charged with adjudicating threats to peace and security. Russia is bypassing it entirely and taking matters into its own hands. And that undermines the institution. It undermines everyone who participates in it. The United States, Ukraine, its allies and partners across Europe, UN officials, every other member of the Security Council, we have all repeatedly implored Russia to engage at the diplomatic table. Those calls were not heard. Instead, tonight, Russia has brought its people, the Ukrainian people, and the world to the brink of a conflict that will produce an untold amount of human suffering. I said it in the General Assembly this morning, and I'll say it again tonight. Everyday Russians should be asking themselves right now, how many Russian lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. Responsible members of this Security Council will stand together, and we will stand with Ukraine. And we will do so despite a reckless, irresponsible, permanent member of the Security Council abusing its powers to attack its neighbor and subvert the UN and our international system. This morning in the General Assembly, we saw dozens of leaders from across the globe stand up to defend the UN Charter and Ukraine against Russia's brazen attacks. We were proud to stand with them. Today, I had the opportunity to meet with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba. And many of you were in the General Assembly Hall this morning when Foreign Minister Kuleba received enthusiastic and overwhelming applause after his remarks. Since he could not be here this evening, I would like to conclude by echoing his words. This morning, he warned us all that, quote, no one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides that he can move forward with this aggression against Ukraine. Your governments and your people will face painful consequences together with our government and our people, unquote. He is right. History tells us that. And we must confront this threat head on in this council, in the UN, and in our capitals. The people of Ukraine are counting on us. Let's not let them down. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю
представителя
Соединенных Штатов за ее заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Соединенного Королевства.
Mr. President, I thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General Di Carlo for their remarks. We are here tonight to call on Russia to avert war. For months, Russia has been holding a gun to Ukraine's head. Now, President Putin's finger is on the trigger. A full-scale conflict in a country of 44 million people will bring immense suffering, casualties on both sides, and devastating humanitarian consequences. The members of this Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary-General have all called this week for respect for the principles of the UN Charter. The world is calling for peace, but Russia is not listening. Mr. President, make no mistake, the UK will not compromise. We will not compromise our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, our support for peace, prosperity, and the democratic freedom of the people of Ukraine. We will not compromise our commitment to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. Above all, the founding principle of this United Nations, that we live together in peace with one another as good neighbours. Russia's actions are an assault on the Charter. And we will not compromise our commitment to a search for peace. We're here for the second time this week in the Council. My Prime Minister and Foreign and Defence Secretaries have been unsparing in their diplomatic efforts. But we have also announced a significant further sanction step against Russia with our allies, a package targeted against some of the Russian oligarchs, banks, and politicians supporting President Putin. And we will ratchet up economic consequences should Russia continue its aggression. There is still time for restraint, reason, and de-escalation. But that time is now. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя Соединенного Королевства за ее
The
заявление.
representative
Сейчас
of the United
предоставляю
Kingdom
слово
for
представителю
her
Франции.
statement, and I now give the floor to representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
President,
je remercie le secrétaire
thank the
général pour sa
Secretary
mobilisation et pour son
for his
appel
engagement
que la France
and for his
soutient
call,
pleinement.
which France
À l'heure où
fully
nous parlons,
supports.
la
As we
Russie
speak,
est sur le point
Russia
de
is on
provoquer
the
le
verge
chaos en
of
Ukraine
provoking
et de
chaos in
porter un
Ukraine
coup injustifiable
and
à la paix
striking
et à la
an
sécurité
unjustifiable
au cœur de
blow
l'Europe.
to peace and
Depuis
security
plusieurs
in the
mois,
heart of Europe.
le président de la Fédération de
For several
Russie
months, the
a
president of the
patiemment
Russian
préparé
Federation
de quoi
has
mener
patiently
une offensive
prepared
majeure
the
contre
means
l'Ukraine.
for a major offensive
Il a amassé
against
des soldats et
Ukraine.
des armes
He has
à un
massed
niveau sans précédent
soldiers and gathered
depuis
weapons
la fin de la
at
Seconde
an
Guerre mondiale
unprecedented level since
Il a
the
incité
end
à la
of the Second
violence
World War.
par le
He has
mensonge et la
incited
désinformation.
violence through
Il a
lies
nié
and
jusqu'à
disinformation.
la légitimité
He has
même de
denied
l'État
even the
ukrainien.
legitimacy of the
Il a
Ukrainian
porté atteinte
state
à la souveraineté
He has
et à
attacked
l'intégrité
sovereignty
de l'Ukraine
and
par la
the
reconnaissance de
integrity
l'indépendance
of
de
Ukraine
portions
by
du territoire
recognizing the
ukrainien.
independence of portions of Ukrainian
Face à cette
territory.
stratégie de
Faced
menace
with a
et
strategy
de
of
déstabilisation,
threats and
l'Ukraine a fait
destabilization,
preuve d'une retenue admirable.
Ukraine has
Elle n'a pas
demonstrated
cédé à la
admirable
violence
restraint.
en dépit
It
des
did not
incitations
resort to
russes.
violence despite
Je veux redire
Russian
notre
provocation.
solidarité avec le
I
peuple
wish to
ukrainien,
reiterate our
comme l'a rappelé le
solidarity
président
with the
Macron
people of Ukraine,
à son homologue ukrainien
as
il y a quelques
President
heures.
Macron reminded his
Face à cette
Ukrainian
stratégie de
counterpart
désordre
a
et
few
de
hours ago.
confrontation, les
Faced
dirigeants
with this
d'Europe et
strategy
des
of
États-Unis
disorder
ont
and
démontré leur
confrontation,
unité
the leaders of
et
Europe and the
redoublé
United
d'efforts
States
pour
showed
proposer
their unity
une issue
and redoubled their
diplomatique.
efforts
Le
to
président Macron,
propose
en lien avec le
a
chancelier
diplomatic
Scholz
outcome.
et de nombreux
President
partenaires,
Macron,
y ont pris toute leur
together
part.
with Chancellor
Ils ont
Scholz
fait part
and
de leur
many
disponibilité
have
à
all
construire
done their part.
avec la Russie
They have
une architecture de
demonstrated
sécurité
their
renouvelée
availability
pour l'Europe.
to build with Russia
La
a
France
renewed
condamne avec
security
force
architecture for
la
Europe.
stratégie de provocation à la guerre du président
France
russe.
strongly condemns the
Nous
strategy
entendons
of
l'appel du
provocation
peuple
to
ukrainien
war of the Russian
porté
president.
par le président
We hear the
Zelensky dans son
call
adresse à la
of
nation
the
il y a
Ukrainian
quelques
people
heures.
conveyed by President
Les Ukrainiens
Zelensky in his
veulent la
address to the
paix.
Russian nation
Ils souhaitent
a
une
few
relation
hours
de bon
ago.
voisinage avec la
Ukrainians
Russie,
want peace.
à
They want
l'image
a relationship
des
of good
relations familiales et
neighborliness
personnelles
with
qui
Russia,
unissent tant de Russes et d'Ukrainiens.
mirroring the family and
Monsieur le
personal
Président,
relationships which
la communauté
bind
internationale
so
a
many
de manière unie
Russians
fait
and
entendre sa
Ukrainians.
voix
The
aujourd'hui à
international
l'Assemblée
community,
générale.
Mr.
C'est
President,
celle du respect
has
de la Charte des
made
Nations
its
Unies,
voice heard,
celle du
its
règlement
united voice
pacifique des
today at
conflits,
the General Assembly.
celle de la diplomatie.
It
Elle
is
fait
out of
écho
respect of the
aux
Charter of the
déclarations
United
claires
Nations,
du
the
secrétaire
peaceful
général.
settlement of disputes,
Nous appelons
that of
une nouvelle fois
diplomacy. It
la
echoes the
Fédération de
clear
Russie
declarations of
à
the
suivre
Secretary
cette
General.
voie, à
Once again,
revenir sur sa
we
décision de
call on the
reconnaissance
Russian
des
Federation to
entités
follow this
séparatistes
path,
de l'Est de l'Ukraine
to
et à
draw
rappeler ses
back
soldats.
on its decision
Nous
to
appelons chacun
recognize
des membres de
separatist
ce
entities
Conseil
of Eastern Ukraine
à
and to
agir en
call its
responsabilité
soldiers back.
et à
We call
soutenir
each of the
de manière
members of this
résolue
council to
toutes
act
les
responsibly
initiatives
and to
visant à
resolutely
prévenir
support
et à mettre un
all
terme
initiatives
aux violations de
to
la Charte
prevent
des
and
Nations
put an
Unies.
end to violations
Si la
of the
Russie
Charter of the United
confirme le choix de la
Nations.
guerre,
If Russia
elle devra en
confirms that
assumer
its
toutes
choice
les
is war,
responsabilités et en
it will
payer
have
le
to
prix.
take all of the responsibility and pay the price. Thank you.
Я благодарю
I
представителя
thank the
Франции за его
representative
заявление.
of France for his
Предоставляю
statement,
слово
and I now give the
представителю
floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General De Carlo for their very sobering remarks at the beginning of our meeting. Mr. President, tonight as we gather at this table, we are staring into the abyss of a major conflict in Europe, a conflict that would have major global implications. Tonight, the core principles of this United Nations, in which we believe, are under attack. In Ireland, we know the importance of the rules-based international order. We know the importance of respecting the voice and integrity of all countries, big or small. Most fundamentally, we know the value of peace. We believe that one state threatening and using lethal force against another to get its way or to expand its territory is no solution. Ireland has a deep understanding, informed by our history, that dialogue and respect resolve disputes. Tonight, this drives our solidarity with Ukraine. It is our collective responsibility, indeed our obligation here at this table, to maintain international peace and security, nothing less. That means we stand up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every member state of the United Nations. Let's be clear, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine have not changed. The decision by Russia to recognize as independent entities the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine does not change those borders one iota. They did not change in 2014, and they have not changed this week. We urge the Russian Federation to reverse this decision immediately. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from further escalatory unilateral actions which can only serve to further deepen this crisis. Tonight, the path for diplomacy, the path for dialogue that we have called on for so long is perilously narrow. The principles of the UN Charter we hold dear have already been breached. These principles now risk being further violated. This is the time to show courage, the courage and the time now to pull back from the precipice, the time to return to dialogue and to diplomacy. The use of military aggression has no place in our modern world. Have we learned absolutely nothing from our history? These United Nations rose from the ashes of 2 world wars. The senseless destruction of that era was born of a belief that military might makes right. This philosophy, applied with modern weaponry, would unleash devastation and human suffering, affecting millions of innocent people. Tonight, we stand with the people of Ukraine. Tonight, we stand with the UN Charter. We stand with those who, even in this dark hour, still have the courage and hope to bring us back from this precipice. A resort to military conquest for one state to impose its will unilaterally against another, to annex part of its territory, has absolutely no place in the 21st century. There is still a choice to turn from the path of war to the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, it is never too late to make the right choice. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Secretary General for his briefing on the evolving situation in the eastern regions of Ukraine. The Security Council had met 2 days ago and discussed the situation. We had called for urgent de-escalation of tensions and emphasized on sustained and focused diplomacy to address all issues concerning the situation. However, we note with regret that the calls of the international community to give time to the recent initiatives undertaken by parties to diffuse tensions were not heeded to. The situation is in danger of spiraling into a major crisis. We express our deep concern over the developments which, if not handled carefully, may well undermine the peace and security of the region. We call for immediate de-escalation and for refraining from any further action that could contribute to a worsening of the situation. We call on all parties to exert greater efforts to bridge divergent interests. I would like to underline that the legitimate security interests of all parties should be fully taken into account. India has consistently advocated at the United Nations the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and with agreements entered into by parties concerned. I underline once again that more than 20,000 Indian nationals, including students, are located in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. We are facilitating the return of all Indian nationals, including students, as may be required. We believe that the solution lies in sustained diplomatic dialogue between the concerned parties. In the meantime, we strongly emphasize the vital need for all sides to maintain international peace and security by exercising the utmost restraint. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس، أود بداية أن أشكر الأمين العام ووكيلة الأمين العام على مداخلاتهما. اجتماعنا هذا هو الاجتماع الرابع الذي يعقده مجلس الأمن حول أوكرانيا في أقل من شهر، وفي ظل التوترات الأخيرة والمثيرة للقلق أخذت بلادي موقفا يتمثل في الدعوة إلى خفض التصعيد والعمل على إيجاد حل سلمي للأزمة. وفي هذا الإطار نود أن نشير للجوانب التالية. أولا، نؤكد على ضرورة اللجوء للحوار وبحسن نية مع تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية على كافة الأصعدة لدعم فرص السلام بالارتكاز للقانون الدولي. ونكرر أن اتفاقات مينسك لا تزال تشكل أساسا جيدا للوصول إلى حل سلمي للأزمة، وبما يحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين والدوليين. ثانيا، نشدد على ضرورة الالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، لا سيما من حيث تسوية المنازعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية واحترام سيادة واستقلال الدول ووحدة أراضيها وسلامتها الإقليمية. إن الالتزام بهذه المبادئ والامتثال لميثاق الأمم المتحدة يعد ركيزة أساسية للتوصل لأي حل مستدام وسلمي للأزمة القائمة. ثالثاً، نكرر بأن الوضع المتأزم في شرق أوكرانيا قد يفاقم من الوضع الحرج للمدنيين، ناهيكم عن استمرار وجود تحديات تتعلق بإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية لبعض المحتاجين، لا سيما في المناطق القريبة من خط النزاع في شرق أوكرانيا، وذلك قبل حدوث التوترات الحالية. إن أي تصعيد آخر قد يؤدي لتفاقم الوضع الإنساني لعدد أكبر من المدنيين، وعليه نكرر أهمية العمل على خفض التصعيد ووقف إطلاق النار، ونهيب في هذا الشأن بجميع الأطراف بأهمية عدم التعرض للمساعدات الإنسانية والمدنيين في مناطق النزاع بما يتماشى مع التزاماتهما بموجب القانون الدولي. وختاما السيد الرئيس، تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية وقف التصعيد واللجوء للحوار البناء ومواصلة العمل لإيجاد حلول سلمية تتسق مع القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة.
Я благодарю
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
President, I thank the Secretary General and USG Rosemary DiCarlo for their important statement. We are facing the dire prospect of a major war in Europe. Norway strongly condemns the decision by President Putin to send Russian troops into Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and the latest announcements of special military operation. These decisions are unjustified, unprovoked, and irresponsible. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions and to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and in the vicinity of its internationally recognized borders. Our thoughts are with those who have already suffered too much due to this conflict, and with all those who are afraid that tomorrow will be a lot worse. We call upon all parties to strictly respect the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law, which calls on the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and civilian infrastructure, and to facilitate safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in Ukraine. Like the Secretary General clearly stated, the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independent of Donetsk and Luhansk regions are violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Let me recall the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, which are now under threat. The Charter applies to all nations, including Russia. Today in the General Assembly, member states from all over the world strongly urge the parties to pursue negotiation towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, with respect for international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Norway urges Russia, as a party to the Minsk Agreement and to the conflict, to fulfill its commitments, to abide by international law, and to return to the path of diplomacy. Russia has taken on a clear commitment to seek a peaceful settlement to this conflict and must honor it. We commend Ukraine's posture of restraint in the face of continued provocation and destabilization efforts. President, let me conclude by again reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席先生。
Thank you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
乌克兰局势
the
正
situation
处
in
于
Ukraine
关键时
is
刻，
at a critical juncture.
中方对此
China has
高
been
度关注。
paying close attention to the
当前
situation.
形势下
In，the current context,
有关各
all
方
parties
都要
concerned
保持克
should
制，
exercise restraint
避免紧
and
张局
avoid
势
the
进一步
further
升级。
escalation of tensions.
我们相信，
We believe that
和平
the
解决
door
乌
to a
克兰
peaceful
问题的大
solution
门
to the Ukraine
没有完
issue
全
is
关
not
上，
fully shut,
也不应
nor
被
should
关
it
上。
be.
中方多次
China
指
has
出，
pointed out on
乌
many
克兰问
occasions
题有
that
其复杂
there
历
is a
史经纬
complex，historical context on
局
the
势
Ukraine
演
issue,
变至今
and that the
是
current
各种因
situation
素
is the
综
result
合
of the
作用的
interplay
结
of
果。
many factors.
中国关于维护国
China's
家主
position
权和
on
领土完
safeguarding
整
the
的立场，
sovereignty and territorial
是一贯的。
integrity of all states has
联
been
合国宪章
consistent.
的宗旨
The
和原
purposes
则
and principles
也
of the
应
UN
当得
Charter
到
should be
共
jointly
同的维
upheld.
护。我们希望
We hope
有
that
关
all
当事方
parties
保持
concerned
冷静
will
和
stay
理性，
cool-headed and rational
致力于根据
and
联合
commit
国宪章
themselves
原则，
to enhance
加强
dialogue
对
and
话协商，
consultation
谈判解决有
to
关问
resolve
题，
relevant issues
妥善
properly
处理
through
各方的
negotiations
合理安全关切。
and address each other's legitimate
当前
security concerns
尤其要避免激
in
化
line
矛
with
盾。
the principles of the UN
中
Charter.
方将继续以自己的方
It is
式
especially
劝和促
important
谈，
at the moment to avoid
欢
fueling
迎并
tensions.
鼓励
China will
一
continue
切
to
致
promote
力于
peace
推
talks
动
in its
外
own
交解
ways
决
and
的
welcomes
努
and
力。
encourages all
谢谢你，
efforts aimed
主席
at a
先生。
diplomatic solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю
I thank
представителя
the
Китая за
representative
его
of
заявление,
China for his
предоставляя
statement,
слово
and now give the
представителю
floor to the
Бразилии.
representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Secretary General and the Undersecretary General, Rosemary DiCarlo, for the information and remarks they have put before the Council tonight. Mr. President, the reports received about the movement of troops into certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine are cause for extreme concern. The threat or use of force against the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of a UN member state is unacceptable. In the present circumstances, the Security Council must act according to its main purpose, as holder of the primary responsibility under the United Nations Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. In the exercise of this responsibility, its actions must be geared towards reduction in tensions, towards assisting parties in their negotiations. This is our primary role. The recourse to arms and confrontation cannot lead to lasting peace. In that regard, we call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from any action that may further increase tensions on the ground. The time is not for belligerent rhetoric, nor for military threats, but to engage truly in a diplomatic process. The means of negotiation have not been exhausted. Immediate de-escalation is of high order. It means, among others, complete and unconditional withdrawal of all military forces as an effective measure for the prevention and removal of threats to peace. Parties must abide by the terms of the Minsk agreements, above all by its call for a comprehensive ceasefire. The monitoring mission of the OSCE can assist if granted unrestrained access in order to verify, identify, and report accordingly any violation of the ceasefire. Furthermore, the parties must allow the rapid, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and persons in vulnerable situations, must be respected unconditionally. We redouble our calls for the parties to work constructively in all relevant instances, such as the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. Negotiations must be mindful of the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of its member states. Negotiations must also, on one hand, take into account the security concerns of all parts of the conflict, and, on the other hand, aim to create the adequate conditions for an inclusive political dialogue which must reflect the diversity of and include representation from all peoples of the region. Brazil does not underestimate the complexity of the current situation, but we insist on dialogue as key to achieve a lasting settlement to this conflict. Too much is at stake here, above all, the lives of many civilians. We owe them all our efforts to bring this crisis to a peaceful solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me begin by, first of all, thanking the Secretary General and USG, Rosemary DiCarlo, for their significant briefings. Mr. Secretary General, Ghana is grateful to you for your clear statements on the situation in Ukraine, in defense of the Charter, the rules-based international order, and our collective security mechanism. The developments that are taking place in Ukraine are indeed troubling. The situation has implications not only for Ukraine and its immediate neighbors, but also for all our countries. Security is indivisible, and the insecurity of one is the insecurity of all. As we indicated in our statement to the Council on Monday night, Ghana deeply regrets the decision of the Russian Federation to unilaterally recognize the non-government controlled regions of Ukraine and to send troops into those regions. We are also deeply concerned by the implications of those decisions, which suggest that the Russian Federation has turned its back on the Minsk agreements and the path of dialogue required to address any concerns it may have over the implementation of the agreements and related security concerns. We have, however, read in reports this morning the statement attributed to the President of the Russian Federation that his country was always open to diplomacy. We urge that that avowed commitment to diplomacy that the Russian Federation has alluded to should be backed by present actions that de-escalate the situation on the ground and permit an atmosphere for dialogue. We note with concern the risk that an escalation of the situation in Ukraine holds for global peace and security, and stress that those that choose the path of conflict rather than peace bear the consequences of their actions. We are concerned by reports of the commencement of hybrid warfare against Ukraine, especially attempts of cyber attacks against some of its critical infrastructure. To de-escalate the situation, we urge the Russian Federation to reconsider any intentions to move troops into the eastern regions of Ukraine in response to the purported request by the leaders of the separatist regions for an intervention. Peacekeeping by its nature requires the consent of the parties and the impartiality of the peacekeeping force. The presence of the Russian troops in eastern Ukraine at this time would not fulfill those requirements. If there is a real need, the Council should be seized of the matter. We urge for calm and call upon all parties to maintain the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. We are particularly concerned by the high intensity of violations of the ceasefire in recent days and its consequences on the civilian populations in the Donbas region. We remind all parties of the need to respect international law and international humanitarian law and urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas. We condemn any military activity that would deliberately target civilians and civilian infrastructure and remind all parties of the personal responsibility that exists in international law. Mr. President, it may be begging the question, but nonetheless worth repeating. Ghana unreservedly stands by the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders, the same borders with which she joined this organization. We are aware that the current developments in the eastern regions of Ukraine would not lead to a strategic gain for any party, and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. As called for by the preamble of the Charter, we remind all parties to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Finally, we take this opportunity to urge all member states to exercise restraints on the respective unsettled but accepted situations across the globe, and to uphold the collective security mechanism established through the Charter of the United Nations. Any differences that exist in international relations must be adjusted by peaceful and legal means. I thank you very much for your kind attention, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General for his urgent plea for peace, and Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. In this grave moment, Kenya continues to call for respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine, in line with the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. Kenya is deeply concerned by the rapid escalation of the conflict risks following the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states by the Russian Federation and the continued military escalation. We are concerned that there is a serious risk that a conflict enveloping the whole of the Donbas region will occur, present trends holding. Such a development would instantly lead to significant loss of life, a humanitarian crisis, and the large-scale population movement of refugees and internally displaced people. Kenya urgently calls for calm by all parties and their commitment to protecting civilians and civilian objects from any actions contrary to international law and international humanitarian law. We continue to believe that there is still an opportunity for diplomacy to produce a solution to this dangerous crisis. The required diplomatic steps should seek, in the short term, for a de-escalation of the situation and the limiting of all military maneuvers to prevent sparking a wider conflict. For this to happen, there must also be a stated commitment to negotiations between NATO and the Russian Federation in the middle and long term. Such a commitment will need the vision to design a viable security architecture for Europe that protects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine and other states, while being sensitive to the concerns of all relevant parties. Mr. President, we want to believe that this chamber, in light of its storied past, retains the wisdom and wherewithal to prevent a catastrophic war. We have confidence that the United Nations Charter, embraced as a whole, protects Ukraine and all countries, not only those with modest military means, but also the world's nuclear powers. When we consider the recent past of wars undertaken by choice, and when the Charter and international law were breached, eventually the safety and security of all parties was tragically undermined. Mr. President, the membership of this chamber was fundamentally shaped by the states that emerged victorious from World War II. In doing so, the Charter bestowed on them a special responsibility that reflected the sacrifices they had made to defeat a unique evil to mankind. We believe that the leaders who designed today's multilateral system were profoundly humbled by the catastrophic war they had survived, so much so that they were inspired to erect the sovereign equality of states as a central pillar of our United Nations. As such, we urge all members to recall the ruin from war that has been experienced by most states sitting around this table. It is in this moment of peril that we can powerfully pivot to recommit to the Charter our predecessors bequeathed us. A large part of that recommitment would be aided by our listening to the Secretary General and utilizing his good offices to deliver according to their intended design. In the coming days, we hope that we will observe de-escalation in Donbas and that every effort will be made to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity,